The night began with the kind of calm that feels almost scripted, as if it were designed to lower every guard in the room. It was meant to be a celebration, one of those dinners where the table is dressed better than the people sitting around it, where candles flicker softly and make even tired faces look warm and honest. Laughter moved easily from one person to another, not forced, not rushed, just enough to suggest comfort and familiarity. Plates were passed around, glasses filled again without being asked, and every small gesture carried the illusion of care. It felt like a moment frozen in time, the kind you assume will later live only as a pleasant memory. I remember sitting there and thinking how rare such nights had become. Everyone had busy lives, hidden tensions, unspoken disagreements, yet here we were, gathered in one place, pretending that nothing was fractured. The food smelled rich and inviting, the kind that takes hours to prepare, as if effort itself were proof of love. Compliments were exchanged casually, jokes landed perfectly, and for a while, it felt safe to relax. There was no hint that this evening would be anything more than what it appeared to be, no sign that beneath the polished surface something was already moving in the shadows. Conversations drifted between harmless topics, stories from the past, shared memories polished until they sounded better than they ever were. People nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, and leaned forward as if deeply invested. Every reaction seemed genuine, rehearsed only by years of knowing exactly how to play their part. I noticed how easily trust settles in environments like this, how quickly the mind stops questioning when the atmosphere feels familiar. The table itself felt symbolic, a circle where no one sat above another, where equality was implied and loyalty assumed. Yet, there was a strange stillness hidden beneath the noise. A pause here and there that lasted just a fraction too long. A glance exchanged quickly, dismissed just as quickly. At the time, it felt insignificant, something easily explained away as coincidence or distraction. I was too focused on the comfort of belonging, on the idea that I was surrounded by people who wanted me there. That belief made everything else fade into the background, including my instincts. The celebration had a reason, though no one emphasized it too much. It was framed as casual, spontaneous, but underneath it all was a purpose that gave the night its energy. Toasts were raised, words of appreciation spoken, each sentence carefully chosen to sound sincere without revealing too much. I listened, feeling a quiet pride, unaware that every compliment carried another meaning, another intention layered beneath the surface. The warmth of the room made it easy to believe every word. As dinner progressed, the atmosphere grew even lighter. Plates were cleared, desserts brought out, and the mood shifted into something almost intimate. This is usually the moment when people let their guard down completely, when truth sometimes slips through jokes or careless remarks. But that night, nothing slipped. Everything remained controlled, contained, as if everyone knew exactly how far to go and no further. That precision should have been a warning, but comfort has a way of dulling caution. I noticed how questions were asked, subtle and indirect, disguised as curiosity. They seemed harmless enough, even friendly. At the time, I answered without hesitation, assuming there was no reason to hold anything back. Why would there be, when the setting itself promised safety? Every response I gave felt like a contribution to the evening, unaware that it was being quietly noted, stored, and evaluated. The dinner was no longer just a gathering, it was a stage, and I was performing without realizing the audience had a different script. The longer the night went on, the more relaxed I became, leaning into the sense of unity the table projected. There was a feeling of being included, of being valued, something that doesn't happen often enough to be taken lightly. I remember thinking how fortunate I was to have people like this around me, how rare it was to feel so completely at ease. That thought alone made the evening feel successful, worth remembering. But celebrations have a way of hiding truth in plain sight. The clinking of cutlery can mask tension. The sound of laughter can cover calculated silence. Even kindness, when performed convincingly, can become a tool. That dinner was built on appearances, on the shared understanding that as long as everything looked perfect, nothing could be wrong. I didn't know then that the very elements that made the night feel special were also what made it dangerous. By the time the evening neared its end, the sense of satisfaction was mutual, though not for the same reasons. Chairs were pushed back, final words exchanged, promises made to do this again soon. I left the table believing I had been part of something genuine, something affirming. I didn't know that the celebration had already served its true purpose, that the real outcome of the night had nothing to do with food, laughter, or togetherness, and everything to do with what had been quietly set in motion while I was too busy enjoying the moment to see it unfolding. The smiles were the first thing I noticed, wide and effortless, the kind that make you feel instantly welcome. They appeared the moment I walked in, practiced yet convincing, stretched perfectly across familiar faces. Each smile seemed to carry its own reassurance, silently promising honesty, loyalty, and goodwill. In spaces like that, smiles become a language of trust, a signal that you are safe among your own. I returned them without hesitation, unaware that some expressions are designed not to reveal emotion, but to conceal intention. As the evening unfolded, those smiles never faded. They remained steady through every conversation, every laugh, every passing of dishes across the table. It was impressive, almost admirable, how consistently they were maintained. Even when discussions turned personal, when stories brushed against sensitive subjects, the smiles stayed intact. Not once did they crack or waver, and that consistency created a powerful illusion of unity. It suggested agreement, support, and shared understanding, even when none truly existed. There was a rhythm to the way people spoke, carefully timed pauses followed by reassuring nods, expressions of interest that seemed genuine on the surface. Compliments were delivered smoothly, placed exactly where they would have the greatest impact. Every word sounded encouraging, every reaction felt affirming. It was easy to believe that the room was filled with people who wanted nothing but the best for one another. The smiles made it effortless to trust the tone, if not the meaning, of what was being said. Yet, behind those expressions lived something else entirely. I could feel it in the way certain eyes observed more than they participated, scanning reactions rather than engaging in conversation. While mouths smiled, eyes calculated. They measured responses, noted discomfort, tracked moments of hesitation. It was subtle, almost invisible, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. The contrast between expression and intention created a quiet tension that lingered beneath the surface of the night. Every now and then, a smile would arrive a second too late, or leave just a fraction too early. These tiny delays revealed more than words ever could. They suggested thought where spontaneity should have existed, control where emotion should have flowed freely. But in the warmth of the moment, these signs were easy to dismiss. After all, who suspects deception in a room filled with familiar faces and shared history? The conversations themselves became a performance. People laughed at jokes they had heard before, reacted with surprise to stories whose endings they already knew. Agreement came too quickly, validation offered too easily. It felt as though everyone was following an unspoken script, one rehearsed long before the dinner began. The smiles were the costume, the final touch that made the act believable. Without them, the cracks might have shown. At times, I noticed how questions were framed with kindness, softened by gentle laughter or a friendly tone. They seemed innocent, even caring, yet they probed just deeply enough to extract useful information. Each answer was met with an encouraging smile, a nod that signaled approval. In reality, those reactions were not acknowledgments of understanding, but confirmations that the conversation was moving in the desired direction. The most unsettling part was how natural it all felt. Deception, when executed well, blends seamlessly into ordinary behavior. The smiles did not appear forced or exaggerated. They were subtle, controlled, perfectly matched to each moment. This made them far more dangerous than obvious hostility ever could be. Hostility warns you. False warmth invites you closer. As the night went on, the smiles became almost hypnotic. They lulled the room into a false sense of harmony, discouraging doubt or suspicion. Any instinct to question was overridden by the desire to belong, to remain part of the collective mood. It is difficult to challenge what looks like happiness, especially when doing so risks being labeled ungrateful or paranoid. The smiles protected not just the people wearing them, but the deception itself. Occasionally, a genuine laugh would break through, blurring the line between truth and performance. These moments made everything even harder to read. When authenticity and manipulation coexist, they strengthen each other, making it nearly impossible to separate one from the other. The smiles fed on this confusion, thriving in the gray area where certainty disappears. I began to realize, though not fully yet, that smiles can be weapons when used strategically. They disarm, distract, and disprove suspicion without ever having to confront it directly. They allow people to say one thing while planning another, to offer comfort while preparing harm. That dinner was filled with such smiles, each one carefully placed, each one hiding something it was never meant to reveal. By the time the night drew closer to its end, those expressions had done their job. Trust had been built, defenses lowered, assumptions solidified. The smiles remained, unchanged, as if frozen in place, preserving the illusion they had created. What I did not yet understand was how much damage could be done by faces that never stop smiling, by intentions hidden so well behind expressions designed to make you feel safe. The moment the food was placed on the table, something unspoken settled into the room. There is a strange intimacy in sharing a meal, a quiet agreement that whatever differences exist outside this space are temporarily set aside. Hands reach toward the same dishes, flavors are discussed, preferences remembered. It creates a sense of connection that feels ancient, almost sacred. Sitting there, passing plates back and forth, it was easy to believe that trust flowed as naturally as the conversation, that the act of eating together meant something deeper than hunger. I had always believed that meals shared are truths shared. That when people sit across from one another and break bread, they do so with openness. It's why so many important conversations happen at tables, why agreements are sealed over dinners, why families gather around food in moments of joy and grief alike. That belief shaped the way I behaved that night. I spoke freely, laughed easily, and allowed myself to be present without armor. The table felt like a boundary that protected everyone seated around it. Each dish carried its own small ritual. Someone recommended a bite, another insisted. As we ate, conversations grew more relaxed. Stories became more personal, details more revealing. There's something about food that loosens tongues, that encourages honesty through comfort. I found myself sharing thoughts I usually kept guarded, experiences I didn't often revisit. Each time I spoke, heads nodded, expressions softened, and understanding seemed to fill the spaces between us. It felt like being heard, like being supported. I didn't notice how carefully my words were being absorbed, how nothing was wasted. The table itself became a stage for this exchange of trust. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted. Respect was performed flawlessly. Even disagreements were softened, wrapped in humor or dismissed with smiles. It appeared mature, healthy, almost admirable. But beneath that calm surface, something was being taken from me piece by piece. Not money, not possessions, but certainty. The certainty that what was shared in that space would remain protected. I remember how natural it felt to assume loyalty. When someone pours you a drink or offers you food, it sends a message of care. It suggests that your well-being matters. That gesture alone can override doubt. I didn't consider that the same hands offering nourishment could also be preparing harm. That contradiction felt impossible in the moment, something that belonged to stories, not real life. As plates emptied and were replaced, the sense of comfort deepened. The act of eating together created a rhythm, a pause between bites where conversation flowed effortlessly. It was during these pauses that the most revealing questions surfaced. They were subtle, casual, framed as interest rather than inquiry. I answered them without hesitation, assuming there was no reason to withhold anything at a table built on trust. Every response felt safe in that environment, protected by the shared understanding that this was a private space. But trust, once extended, becomes vulnerable. The more comfortable I grew, the less I filtered my words. I spoke as though the people listening were invested in my success, my happiness. I believed the shared meal implied shared intentions. That belief shaped every interaction, every response. I didn't see how easily trust can be manipulated when it's offered freely. There is a particular cruelty in betrayal that happens over food. It transforms something meant to nourish into something that poisons. That night, I didn't feel the poison yet. I felt full, satisfied, content. The betrayal was subtle, invisible, working quietly beneath the surface. It didn't announce itself. It didn't disrupt the mood. It simply existed, growing stronger with every shared bite. I noticed, though faintly, how certain comments lingered in the air a bit longer than others. How some reactions felt slightly delayed, as if processed before being expressed. At the time, I dismissed these observations as nothing more than fatigue or overthinking. The table still felt safe. The food still tasted good. The environment still suggested unity. What I didn't understand was how trust can be broken without a single harsh word, without a raised voice or visible conflict. Sometimes it's broken gently, carefully, in moments that feel harmless. That dinner table, surrounded by shared food and familiar faces, became the place where trust quietly slipped away, not through confrontation, but through comfort, through the belief that sharing a meal meant sharing loyalty, through the assumption that no one would dare to betray someone while sitting across from them, passing dishes, smiling, and pretending that everything on the table was exactly what it appeared to be. It didn't arrive as a shock or a dramatic revelation. The truth revealed itself quietly, almost politely, slipping into my awareness in pieces so small they were easy to ignore at first. There was no single moment I could point to and say that everything changed there. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like a picture coming into focus one detail at a time. At first, it felt more like a vague discomfort than certainty, a sense that something wasn't aligned the way it should be. I began noticing inconsistencies, minor enough to dismiss on their own but unsettling when placed side by side. A statement repeated differently. A promise recalled with missing details. Someone reacting defensively to a question that had been asked casually. None of it was enough to accuse or confront, but together they formed a pattern that refused to disappear. The more I tried to rationalize it, the louder the unease became. The silence between conversations started to speak louder than the words themselves. Pauses felt heavier, loaded with meaning that no one acknowledged. There were moments when laughter ended too abruptly, when eyes avoided mine just long enough to suggest discomfort. These were not obvious signs of guilt, but they were not signs of innocence either. They existed in the space between, where doubt begins to grow. I found myself replaying the dinner in my mind, dissecting interactions I had once dismissed as harmless. Questions that seemed friendly now felt calculated. Compliments sounded rehearsed. Even the warmth of the room began to feel artificial in memory, like a set built to look real from a distance. The more I reflected, the clearer it became that something had been hidden beneath the surface, something I hadn't been meant to see at the time. The realization didn't bring immediate anger. It brought clarity. A calm, unsettling clarity that stripped away excuses and justifications. I stopped defending people in my thoughts, stopped searching for innocent explanations. Instead, I allowed the possibility that what I felt wasn't paranoia, but awareness arriving late. That shift changed everything. It reframed the entire evening, transforming it from a celebration into a carefully managed performance. What surprised me most was how the truth revealed itself without confrontation. No one confessed. No evidence was dramatically placed in front of me. The understanding came from connections made internally, from observing how actions aligned with outcomes. Certain decisions began to make sense only when viewed through the lens of betrayal. Opportunities that disappeared. Information that spread faster than it should have. Outcomes that benefited certain people more than others. I noticed how behavior changed once the dinner was over. The warmth cooled. Communication became distant, less spontaneous. Messages were shorter, meetings postponed, enthusiasm faded. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The shift confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. People don't distance themselves without reason. They don't retreat unless there's something they want to avoid. There was a particular moment, small and almost insignificant, that solidified everything. A comment made in passing, referencing something I had shared privately at the table. The detail was too specific, too precise to be coincidence. It revealed that my words had traveled further than they should have, carried beyond the space where they were meant to remain. In that moment, the last layer of doubt dissolved. The truth didn't feel dramatic when it settled in. It felt heavy, grounding, unavoidable. It explained the tension I had sensed, the discomfort I couldn't name. It confirmed that my trust had been misplaced, not by accident, but by design. The realization was painful, but it was also empowering. Seeing clearly, even when the truth hurts, is a form of control. I began to understand how easily truth can hide behind familiarity. When people know you well, they know how to appear trustworthy. They know which behaviors to repeat, which emotions to display. That knowledge makes deception efficient. The truth, in contrast, doesn't announce itself loudly. It waits for you to be ready to see it. As the pieces came together, my perspective shifted completely. The dinner table was no longer a symbol of unity in my mind. It became the place where reality first began to surface. Not through chaos or confrontation, but through quiet observation and delayed understanding. The betrayal revealed itself not in a single explosive moment, but in a series of small recognitions that, once acknowledged, could no longer be ignored, forming a truth so clear that denying it would have required far more effort than accepting it. After the truth settled in, there was a strange quiet that followed, heavier than any argument could have been. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that brings relief, but a charged stillness, the kind that makes every sound feel amplified because so much is being left unsaid. I noticed it first within myself. The urge to speak rose and fell, restrained by the understanding that words, once released, could not be taken back. Silence felt safer, not because it was comfortable, but because it allowed space to think. Around me, that same silence existed in fragments. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Conversations became polite but shallow. Familiar warmth was replaced by formal distance. No one addressed what had happened, yet everyone seemed aware that something fundamental had shifted. It was as if an unspoken agreement had formed to avoid the truth rather than confront it. Silence became a shield, protecting those who had something to hide and isolating those who had begun to see clearly. I realized then how powerful silence can be. It can be louder than accusations, more revealing than confession. In the absence of explanation, behavior becomes the evidence. Who reaches out and who doesn't? Who avoids eye contact? Who suddenly becomes busy? Each quiet reaction added another layer to my understanding. Nothing needed to be said out loud. The truth echoed in the gaps. There were moments when the silence felt unbearable, when I wanted clarity more than anything else. I imagined confronting them, laying out everything I had noticed, demanding answers. But each time, I held back. I sensed that speaking too soon would only give them control over the narrative. Silence, for now, was not weakness. It was observation. It allowed me to watch without interference, to see how events unfolded when no one was being challenged. In that stillness, patterns emerged. I saw how alliances shifted subtly, how conversations happened without me, how decisions were made quiet. At times, the quiet felt intentional, almost strategic. It was as though they believed that by saying nothing, the situation would fade, that discomfort would dissolve with time. Silence can be used that way, as a way to wait out consequences, to let confusion replace accountability. But silence also preserves memory. It gives the mind time to connect dots, to revisit moments without emotional interference. I noticed how my own silence changed me. I became more reserved, more deliberate. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I reacted. The emotional impulse to seek reassurance slowly gave way to a steadier sense of awareness. I no longer needed confirmation from anyone else. The quiet had given me enough information on its own. The space created by silence also revealed who was uncomfortable with it. Some people filled it with unnecessary explanations, talking too much without being asked. Others avoided it entirely, keeping interactions brief and impersonal. Each response carried meaning. Those with nothing to hide rarely fear silence. Those who do often rush to fill it or flee from it. There was a particular weight to sitting across from them again, sharing the same physical space while pretending nothing had changed. The silence between us was thick, layered with everything we refused to acknowledge. Polite smiles replaced genuine ones. Conversations stayed on safe topics, avoiding anything that required honesty. The contrast between how things were and how they had become was impossible to ignore. In that quiet, I also began to understand my own role. Silence gave me the chance to reflect, not just on their actions, but on my willingness to trust, my tendency to assume good intentions. It wasn't self-blame, but self-awareness. The betrayal had exposed more than just their character. It had revealed where I had ignored instincts in favor of comfort. The stillness sharpened my focus. It reminded me that not every response needs to be immediate, that restraint can be a form of strength. Silence allowed me to regain control, to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. It created distance between feeling and action, a distance I hadn't realized I needed. What lingered most was the understanding that silence was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of unspoken truths, full of consequences waiting for the right moment. The room could be quiet, conversations minimal, interactions controlled, but beneath it all, something irreversible had already taken place, and the silence that followed was not an ending, but a pause heavy with awareness, observation, and intention. Karma rarely announces itself when it arrives. It doesn't knock loudly or demand attention. Instead, it moves quietly, almost respectfully, waiting for the exact moment when its presence will be felt most deeply. After everything that had unfolded, I began to notice changes that at first seemed unrelated, coincidences easily dismissed. But patterns have a way of revealing intention when observed long enough, and soon it became clear that something was shifting beyond my control or influence. The people who once moved confidently began to hesitate. Plans they spoke about with certainty started to fall apart without explanation. Opportunities they expected to secure slipped away, replaced by obstacles they hadn't anticipated. None of this happened suddenly. It unfolded gradually, step by step, as if the universe itself was taking notes and responding in its own time. There were no confrontations, no dramatic exchanges, just a quiet reversal of fortune that spoke louder than any accusation could. I watched from a distance, no longer emotionally invested in the outcome. The silence I had learned to hold gave me clarity, and with that clarity came detachment. I didn't need to interfere or seek revenge actively. Events were aligning on their own. People who once controlled the narrative began to lose their footing, struggling to explain setbacks they never saw coming. Their confidence eroded slowly, replaced by frustration and confusion. What stood out most was how their own actions became the source of their downfall. The same behaviors they had used to manipulate and deceive now worked against them. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. Allies grew cautious. Support faded. Words that once carried weight lost their power. Karma didn't need to expose them publicly. It simply allowed others to see what had been hidden all along. I noticed how excuses became frequent. Justifications replaced accountability. There was a visible effort to regain control, to restore an image that had started to crack. But image, once damaged, is fragile. Small mistakes drew more attention than they should have. Minor failures felt heavier than before. The protection they once relied on no longer held. Karma had a way of removing safety nets without anyone noticing until it was too late. There was no satisfaction in watching this unfold, no sense of triumph or celebration. Instead, there was a quiet understanding. Karma wasn't acting out of malice or favor. It was simply balancing what had been disturbed. The scales were adjusting, not dramatically, but accurately. Each consequence matched its cause in a way that felt inevitable rather than cruel. As their situation shifted, so did mine. The weight I had carried began to lift. Without confrontation or closure, I found myself moving forward. Clarity replaced confusion. Confidence returned, not rooted in ego, but in self-respect. I no longer questioned what had happened or why. I understood that not every betrayal requires retaliation. Some require patience. The contrast became undeniable. While they struggled to maintain control, I regained mine by letting go. Where they faced resistance, I found stability. Where they encountered doubt, I experienced certainty. Karma had drawn a line, separating paths that once ran parallel. The divergence was subtle, but permanent. I observed how people around them began to notice the changes. Whispers replaced admiration. Skepticism replaced trust. The same environment that once supported them now demanded proof, consistency, integrity. Standards they had avoided were now unavoidable. Karma didn't isolate them. It exposed them to the consequences of their own behavior. There was a moment when one of them tried to reconnect, reaching out with a familiarity that no longer existed. The tone was cautious, uncertain, lacking the confidence it once had. That single interaction confirmed everything. Power dynamics had shifted. The control they once held was gone, replaced by vulnerability they couldn't mask with smiles or silence. Karma, I realized, isn't about punishment. It's about reflection. It forces people to face the reality of who they've been and what they've done. It doesn't rush. It doesn't miss. It arrives when denial is no longer possible and leaves lessons that can't be ignored. What had begun as a betrayal at a dinner table had completed its cycle, not through confrontation or revenge, but through a quiet, undeniable reordering of lives, where consequences settled naturally, and justice unfolded without ever needing to be announced.